If you were to stand today in the center of the great entrance hall of Winfield Hall, closing your eyes against the decay of the modern world, you would not hear the sound of laughter. You would not hear the rustle of silk skirts, the clinking of crystal champagne flutes, or the polite murmurs of the American aristocracy. Instead, if you listened closely to the echoes bouncing off the cold pink marble walls, you would hear a different sound, a metallic, rhythmic, clinking, clink, clink, clink. It is the sound of nickels and dimes falling one by one, millions upon millions of them stacking up to build a monument to a man's vanity. This mansion, rising like a white spectre from the manicured lawns of Glen Cove, Long Island, was not built with old money. It was not inherited, nor was it granted by a king. It was built on the backs of the smallest, most insignificant coins in the American economy. It was the Palace of Pennies, a structure of such overwhelming grandeur that it seemed to challenge God himself. But as its creator, Frank Winfield Woolworth, would discover too late, you can build a staircase out of marble that costs $2 million, but you cannot pay a stonemason to carve happiness. To understand the tragedy of Winfield Hall, one must first confront the sheer, crushing weight of its ambition. Completed in 1916 at the twilight of the Gilded Age, the house was designed to be the ultimate statement of arrival. Frank Woolworth, the five-and-dime king, did not want a home. He wanted a palace that would make the Vanderbilts and the Astors feel poor. He commissioned the architect C.P.H. Gilbert with a simple, terrifying instruction: build something that will last forever. He wanted a fortress against time, against fire, and against irrelevance. The result was a sprawling Italian Renaissance manor that defied logic. The main staircase alone is a masterpiece of excess, a cascading waterfall of pink marble carved with such intricate delicacy that it looks like frozen lace. The walls were panelled in walnut and gold leaf. The ceilings were painted with frescoes that mimicked the great cathedrals of Europe. There was a pipe organ so massive that its music could shake the foundations of the house, a mechanical beast that Woolworth would play late at night when he couldn't sleep. The cost of this construction was astronomical, estimated at $9 million in 1916, a sum that, when adjusted for inflation and the relative buying power of the era, represents a fortune that is almost impossible to comprehend today. And the most shocking part, Frank Woolworth paid for it in cash, but Winfield Hall was more than just a display of wealth. It was a psychological map of its owner. Frank Woolworth was a man possessed by a specific, peculiar obsession: Napoleon Bonaparte. The Emperor of France was Frank's idol, his spiritual twin. Woolworth saw himself as the Napoleon of commerce, a man who had risen from nothing to conquer the world, not with armies, but with retail stores. This obsession bled into the architecture of the house. He built a bedroom that was an exact replica of Napoleon's suite at the Palace of Compiègne. He slept in a bed shaped like a boat, surrounded by imperial eagles, and the letter N stamped in gold. He would pace the halls of Winfield Hall wrapped in a dressing gown, imagining himself the ruler of an empire. Yet for all its imperial grandeur, the house was cold. It was a silent witness to a profound and deepening isolation. The marble that lined the floors and walls acted as a mirror, reflecting the emptiness of the lives inside. By the time the mansion was finished, the Woolworth family was already fracturing under the weight of their own fortune. The house was designed to withstand fire, a phobia of Frank's after his previous home had burned to the ground, but it had no defense against the colder, slower destruction of the human spirit. It was a mausoleum for the living. The servants who glided silently through the hidden corridors whispered that the house felt uninhabited even when the family was home. The vast dining room, capable of seating 50 guests, often hosted only Frank and his wife, Jenny. And it was there, in the silence between the courses, that the tragedy began to reveal itself. Jenny Woolworth, the woman who had stood by Frank when he was a penniless clerk, was losing her mind. She sat in the midst of this unimaginable luxury, staring blankly at the gold leaf, her memory dissolving into a fog of early-onset dementia. Frank had built her a palace, but she no longer knew where she was. Winfield Hall was meant to be a legacy, a testament to the power of the American dream. Instead, it became a gilded cage for a family that was slowly suffocating under the weight of its own success. The coins kept stacking up, higher and higher, building walls that were too thick to escape. The five-and-dime king had built his throne, but as he looked around his marble kingdom, he began to realize that he was ruling over a realm of ghosts. The tragedy had been poured into the foundation along with the concrete, and soon it would rise up to claim his favorite daughter, his sanity, and his name. The Palace of Pennies was open for business, but the price of admission was going to be much higher than 10 cents. To fully grasp the magnitude of the silence inside Winfield Hall, we must first journey back to a time when Frank Woolworth's life was defined not by marble and gold, but by mud and failure. Before he was the king, he was a farm boy from upstate New York, trapped in a life of potato harvests and freezing winters. He was not a prodigy. In fact, his early employers considered him slow, clumsy, and utterly unfit for the world of commerce. He was fired from early jobs for being unable to sell. He was a man who seemed destined for a life of invisible mediocrity. But beneath that awkward, stumbling exterior lay a mind that was burning with a quiet, desperate ambition. He didn't just want to succeed, he wanted to matter. The spark that ignited the empire and eventually built the cursed mansion came from a realization that was as simple as it was revolutionary. In the late 19th century, shopping was a rigid, formal dance. Goods were kept behind counters, customers had to ask for items, prices were haggled. Frank saw the inefficiency of this. He saw the desire in the eyes of the common people who wanted to touch, to hold, to buy, without the shame of asking the price. He covered a table in a dry goods store with red cloth, piled it high with surplus inventory, and placed a crude sign above it. Any article on this counter, 5 cents. The result was pandemonium. The goods vanished, the coins flowed in. In that moment, the 5 and dime was born. Frank had discovered a fundamental truth about human nature. People do not just buy what they need, they buy to feel good. He turned shopping into a form of entertainment for the working class. From that single red table grew a colossus. By 1912, the F.W. Woolworth Company controlled hundreds of stores across the globe. He built the Woolworth Building in Manhattan, a Gothic skyscraper dubbed the Cathedral of Commerce, which stood as the tallest building in the world. He had conquered the commercial landscape. He was the richest man in retail. But wealth was not enough for Frank. Somewhere along the way, the farm boy from Rodman, New York, began to lose touch with the reality of who he was. He looked in the mirror and didn't see a shopkeeper. He saw a conqueror. His obsession with Napoleon Bonaparte deepened into something that bordered on a delusion. Frank felt a spiritual kinship with the French emperor. Both were men of modest height, both were outsiders, and both had risen from obscurity to rule empires. Frank began to collect Napoleonic artifacts with a feverish intensity. He bought the emperor's letters, his jewelry, his furniture. He studied his military campaigns, applying the strategies of the battlefield to the world of discount retail. This obsession was not a harmless hobby. It was a symptom of a growing isolation. As his empire expanded, his circle of trust shrank. He became imperious, demanding absolute loyalty and control. He viewed his family not just as loved ones, but as subjects in his dynastic plan. He wanted to establish a lineage that would rival the royal houses of Europe. But fate has a way of mocking men who try to play God. The construction of Winfield Hall was triggered by a disaster that foreshadowed the family's doom. Before the Marble Palace existed, Frank had built another mansion on the same spot. It was a grand Victorian wooden structure, a testament to his early success. But in February 1916, a fire broke out. The flames consumed the house with terrifying speed. Frank watched as his home, his possessions, and his security turned to ash in a matter of hours. The fire destroyed everything, but miraculously, the family survived. The trauma of that night changed Frank. It hardened him. Standing in the smoking ruins, he made a vow. He would rebuild, but this time he would defeat the element of fire. He told his architects that he wanted a house that was indestructible. "I want a house that will last for eternity," he reportedly said, "not a stick of wood." And so, Winfield Hall was conceived not out of joy but out of paranoia and defiance. It was designed as a fortress. The walls were made of stone and concrete. The doors were lined with steel. The roof was slate. It was a bunker disguised as a palace. Frank believed that if he built the walls thick enough, if he used enough marble and steel, he could keep his family safe from the chaos of the world. He could protect his legacy. But as the new walls of Winfield Hall rose, gleaming white against the green lawns of Long Island, Frank failed to realize that the real danger was not coming from sparks or flames. It was coming from within. He was building a fireproof box, but he was locking himself in with demons that no amount of concrete could hold back. The obsession with Napoleon, the desperate need for control, and the belief that money could solve any problem, these were the true architects of the tragedy. The emperor was building his St. Helena, his final island of exile, and he was dragging his fragile wife and daughters into the fortress with him. The rise of the merchant Napoleon was complete, but the fall was already written in the blueprints. While Frank Woolworth was busy playing the role of the American emperor, conquering commerce and building fortresses, a much quieter, slower tragedy was unfolding in the upstairs rooms of Winfield Hall. It is often said that behind every great man is a great woman, and for decades Jenny Woolworth had been the bedrock of Frank's life. She was the one who had scraped pennies together with him in their early days of poverty. She had managed their small home when they couldn't afford coal for the fire. She had believed in his vision when the world called him a fool. But now, as they stood at the summit of the world, surrounded by servants, gold, and adulation, Jenny was fading away. The silent witness of Winfield Hall saw what the newspapers did not. To the public, Mrs. Woolworth was the matriarch of a dynasty, a woman of unimaginable privilege living in a fairy tale castle. But inside the limestone walls, Jenny was becoming a ghost in her own home. She was suffering from a condition that doctors at the time struggled to diagnose or treat, likely early-onset dementia or severe depressive psychosis. Whatever the clinical name, the result was a heartbreaking erosion of the self. The woman who had helped build the empire could no longer recognize it. The tragedy was amplified by the setting. Frank had designed Winfield Hall to be a stage for grand social events. The Gold Room, a French-style salon dripping with 14-karat gold. Leaf was meant for brilliant conversation and gaiety. The dining room, with its intricate wood carvings and massive fireplace, was built for feasts. But Jenny was no longer capable of playing the role of the grand hostess. She would often wander through the cavernous hallways of the mansion, her eyes glazed and confused, running her hands over the cold marble as if trying to remember where she was. The sheer scale of the house, intended to impress, served only to disorient and terrify her. Frank, a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his environment, found himself utterly helpless in the face of his wife's decline. His response was a mixture of denial and desperate, clumsy love. He tried to fix her sadness with the only tool he had left: money. He bought her emeralds, diamonds, and furs. He filled her rooms with orchids. He surrounded her with the most expensive objects on earth, hoping that the sheer weight of luxury would anchor her back to reality. But Jenny didn't want diamonds. She wanted clarity, and that was the one thing Frank's fortune could not buy. The dinner parties at Winfield Hall became exercises in agonizing tension. Imagine the scene: a long mahogany table set with the finest silver and china, flanked by titans of industry, bankers, and socialites. At the head of the table sits Frank, loud, boisterous, recounting tales of his business conquests. And at the other end sits Jenny, staring vacantly into the middle distance, perhaps murmuring to herself or failing to recognize the guests. The servants, trained in the art of invisibility, would silently guide her hand to her water glass or wipe her chin, while the guests politely averted their eyes, pretending not to notice that the queen of the castle had lost her crown. To cope with the unbearable silence that settled over the house when the guests left, Frank turned to his other obsession: the music. He had installed a massive Aeolian pipe organ in the main hall, an instrument so powerful it rivaled those found in the world's great cathedrals. It cost countless thousands of dollars and was wired into the very structure of the building. Late at night, when Jenny had been put to bed by her nurses, Frank would sit at the console. He didn't play soft lullabies. He played Wagner. He played thunderous, crashing symphonies that shook the crystal chandeliers and vibrated through the floorboards. The servants whispered that he played to drown out the sounds of the empty house. He played to fill the void where his wife's personality used to be. The music would roar through the marble corridors, a deafening cry of frustration from a man who had conquered the world but lost his partner. Upstairs in the darkened bedroom, Jenny would perhaps stir in her sleep, the vibrations of the organ reaching her like a distant storm. Winfield Hall thus became a house of two distinct realities. Downstairs, it was the Palace of Pennies, a monument to success and power. Upstairs, it was a high-end asylum, a place of confusion and shadows. The architecture itself seemed to conspire to hide the truth. The thick walls and heavy velvet curtains dampened the sounds of confusion, sealing the tragedy within. Frank Woolworth had built a home that was fireproof, stormproof, and time-proof, but he had failed to realize that the most destructive force was already inside the gates. The forgotten wife wandered the halls of her marble prison, a living reminder that you can own the kingdom, but you are still subject to the tyranny of the mind. And as bad as things were, the silent witness knew that the true breaking point was yet to come. The shadow of death was moving from the mother to the daughter, preparing to strike the blow that would shatter the merchant Napoleon forever. If Jenny Woolworth was the ghost haunting the upper floors of Winfield Hall, Edna Woolworth was supposed to be its shining future. She was the second of Frank's three daughters and undeniably his favorite. Edna was the spirited one, the intelligent one, the one who most resembled her father in ambition and fire. Frank had groomed her to be a society queen. He had lavished her with education, travel, and a dowry that would make a princess blush. He believed that while he was the emperor of commerce, Edna would be the empress of New York society. But in the spring of 1917, the curse that seemed to target the Woolworth bloodline stopped lurking in the shadows and struck with brutal public force. Edna was married to Franklin Law's Hutton, a handsome, charming stockbroker who looked perfect on paper. But behind the closed doors of their luxury apartments, the marriage was a disaster. Hutton was a notorious womanizer, a man who spent the Woolworth fortune on mistresses and alcohol while neglecting his wife. Edna, trapped in the gilded cage of expectations, grew increasingly desperate. She was a woman of the modern age, intelligent and aware, suffocating in a life where her only job was to look happy and ignore the lipstick on her husband's collar. On May 2nd, 1917, the tension snapped. Edna was staying at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, the crown jewel of New York luxury. It was a place of high tea, crystal chandeliers, and polite whispers. But on that morning, a scream tore through the silence of the suite. The person to find Edna was not a maid, nor a doctor, nor her husband. It was her 5-year-old daughter, Barbara. The little girl wandered into her mother's bedroom to find Edna unresponsive. The scene was one of terrifying stillness. The autopsy would later be a matter of intense speculation and hushed bribes, but the image burned into the child's mind was clear. Her beautiful mother, cold and still, amidst the silk sheets of one of the most expensive rooms in America. When the news reached Frank Woolworth at Winfield Hall, the merchant Napoleon collapsed. This was the one blow he had not prepared for. He had built fireproof walls to protect his possessions, but he had no defense against the death of his beloved child. He rushed to the city, but it was too late. Edna was gone at the age of 33. Then came the cover-up. In 1917, suicide was not just a tragedy. It was a mortal sin and a social catastrophe. It was a stain that could ruin a dynasty. Frank Woolworth, grief-stricken but ever the businessman, went into damage control mode. He used his immense power and fortune to silence the press and the coroner. The official cause of death was listed as mastoiditis, an ear infection that led to suffocation. It was a flimsy, medically questionable explanation that raised eyebrows across New York. The rumors swirled immediately that a bottle of poison had been found by the bedside, that Edna had finally succumbed to the despair of her loveless marriage. But Frank's money built a wall around the truth. The autopsy results were buried as deep as the foundation of his skyscrapers. The funeral was held in the music room of Winfield Hall. The massive pipe organ which Frank usually played to soothe his own insomnia now groaned with funeral dirges. The house, built to celebrate triumph, was inaugurated with tragedy. Frank sat in the front row, a broken man. Witnesses said he looked as if he had aged 20 years overnight. The dream of a happy dynasty died in that coffin with Edna. But the most tragic victim of the Plaza incident was not the dead, but the living. 5-year-old Barbara Hutton, the little girl who found the body, was brought back to Winfield Hall to live with her grandfather. This is the moment the curse truly took root in the mansion. The house became the nursery for the poor little rich girl. Imagine the life of this child. She had lost her mother to a mysterious death and her father to abandonment. Now she was trapped in a marble palace with a grandmother who was losing her mind and a grandfather who was consumed by grief and obsession. Barbara would wander the vast, echoing corridors of Winfield Hall, a tiny figure in a house built for giants. She was surrounded by servants who pitied her and relatives who coveted her inheritance. It was here, in the cold shadow of the grand staircase, that Barbara learned her first and most painful lesson, that money is not a shield, it is a magnet for tragedy. The death of Edna Woolworth cast a pall over Winfield Hall that would never lift. The parties stopped. The laughter, which had been scarce to begin with, vanished entirely. The Palace of Pennies had become a mausoleum, housing a grieving emperor, a mad empress, and a traumatized orphan. The gold leaf on the walls still shone, but the air inside was thick with the dust of the grave. Frank Woolworth had wanted to be immortal. He was about to learn that immortality is a curse when you have to live through the death of everything you love. The final irony of Frank Woolworth's life was that the house he built to last for eternity only held him for 2 short years. In April 1919, just 24 months after moving into his marble fortress, the Emperor of the 5 and dime died. He passed away in his sleep, surrounded by his Napoleonic relics, his heart finally giving out under the weight of his grief and his empire. He left behind a retail kingdom that spanned the globe, a fortune that rivaled the GDP of small nations, and a family that was shattered beyond repair. The funeral at Winfield Hall was a spectacle of state. Thousands of mourners lined the streets of Glen Cove. The great organ roared once more. But amidst the black veils and the mountains of lilies, all eyes were fixed on a small, pale child standing near the coffin. Barbara Hutton, now 7 years old, was an orphan in every way that mattered. Her mother was dead by suicide. Her father had abandoned her to chase other women. Her grandmother was lost in the fog of dementia. And now her grandfather, her protector, was gone. When the will was read, the curse of the Woolworth fortune tightened its grip. A massive portion of Frank's wealth, estimated at roughly $28 million at the time, or nearly $500 million today, bypassed the adults and landed squarely on the narrow shoulders of little Barbara. Overnight, the lonely girl from the upstairs nursery became one of the wealthiest heiresses in the world. The press, sensing the delicious tragedy of her situation, coined a nickname that would haunt her until her dying day: the poor little rich girl. For the next several years, Winfield Hall became Barbara's golden prison. It is easy to look at a mansion and see luxury, but for a child, a house of that size is a landscape of terror. Imagine growing up in a home with 60 rooms, most of them empty. Imagine playing hide and seek with no one to seek you. The servants were instructed to treat her like porcelain, terrified that she might break. She had the finest toys, the most expensive dolls imported from Paris, and a wardrobe of silk dresses, but she had no one to hug. The silent witness of the house watched as Barbara learned the twisted lessons that would define her adult life. She learned that affection was transactional. She saw her father, Franklin Hutton, suddenly return to her life, not to comfort her, but to manage her trust fund. She watched as relatives squabbled over the silver and the art, while her grandfather's body was barely cold. The cold marble of the grand staircase taught her that warmth was a rare commodity, and that people were drawn to the glitter of the gold, not the soul of the person holding it. As Barbara grew up and eventually left Winfield Hall, she took the darkness of the house with her. The tragedy of her adult life reads like a grim fairy tale. Desperate to find the love she never had in those echoing corridors, she married 7 times. She married princes, counts, barons, and playboys, including Cary Grant and Porfirio Rubirosa. Each time she hoped to find a home. Each time she found only men who wanted her money. The press devoured her. They mocked her spending, her jewels, and her sadness. Barbara spent money with a manic intensity that mirrored her grandfather's construction of the house. She bought palaces in Morocco, mansions in London, and entire collections of jewelry, including the jewels of Marie Antoinette. It was as if she were trying to build a wall of diamonds to keep the sadness out, just as Frank had tried to build a wall of marble to keep the fire out. But the sadness always got in. She succumbed to anorexia, drug addiction, and alcohol, her body becoming as frail as her grandmother Jenny's mind had been. Back at Winfield Hall, the house itself seemed to mourn the family's disintegration. After Frank's death, the estate passed through various hands, but it never shook the feeling of melancholy. The grand organ fell silent, The gardens, once manicured to the millimetre, began to overgrow. The house stood on the hill like a tombstone for the American dream. It was proof that you can win the game of capitalism and still lose the game of life. Barbara Hutton died in 1979, living in a hotel room, weighing less than 90 pounds with less than $30,500 left in her bank account. She had given it all away, the millions, the palaces, the jewels, trying to buy the one thing she couldn't find in the nursery of Winfield Hall: peace. The fortune that had been minted in nickel and dimes had evaporated, leaving behind only the stone skeleton of the mansion where it all began. The poor little rich girl had finally escaped the curse, but the house remained, waiting for its next victim, its walls still echoing with the sound of a lonely child's footsteps on the cold, hard stone. When the last of the Woolworth dynasty finally vacated Winfield Hall, the house did not fall silent. Instead, it entered a strange twilight existence, drifting through the 20th century like a grand ocean liner that had lost its captain. For a building designed to be a private fortress for a single family, its afterlife was bizarrely public. In the ensuing decades, the marble halls that had once intimidated bankers and barons were filled with the sound of clicking heels and young laughter. For a time, the estate became the Grace Downs Academy, a business school for young women training to be airline stewardesses and models. It is a surreal image, dozens of young women in uniforms practicing their posture on the same grand staircase where Frank Woolworth had once marched in his Napoleonic robes, and where little Barbara Hutton had sat alone waiting for a father who never came. But even filled with the energy of youth, the house refused to let go of its past. The students whispered. They spoke of cold spots in the hallways that had no draught. They claimed to hear the sound of a woman weeping in the upper bedrooms, the Marie Antoinette room, where Jenny Woolworth had spent her final, confused years. And most chillingly, there were reports of the great pipe organ, long since disconnected and dusty, suddenly wheezing to life in the dead of night, playing a few discordant notes before falling silent again. The silent witness was finding new ways to speak. After the school closed, the mansion fell into a long period of eccentricity and decay. It was purchased by Martin Carey, the brother of the former New York governor. Carey was a collector, not a restorer. Under his ownership, Winfield Hall became a warehouse for antiques and oddities. The gardens grew wild, the Italian fountains cracked, the paint peeled from the frescoes. The house began to look less like a palace and more like the setting of a Gothic horror novel. It stood behind its rusted iron gates, a white leviathan breathing shallowly, waiting for an end that wouldn't come. Then history circled back on itself with a cruel sense of irony. Frank Woolworth had built Winfield Hall specifically to be fireproof. He had banned wood. He had used steel and stone. He had spent millions to ensure that flames could never take his home again. But on January 28, 2015, the impossible happened. A fire broke out in the north wing of the mansion. The flames tore through the clock tower bedroom. Firefighters rushed to the scene, their hoses snake-like against the marble floors. They managed to save the structure. Frank's concrete walls held true, but the damage was symbolic. The fire destroyed the intricate woodwork of the room that had been designed to look like the interior of a luxury yacht. It was as if the curse of the Woolworths, the fire that destroyed his first home, the fire of madness that consumed his wife, the fire of despair that killed his daughter, had returned one last time to mock the architect's arrogance. The house could withstand the heat, but it could not escape the karma of its creation. In recent years, Winfield Hall was put on the market. The price tag was a fraction of what it would cost to build today. It sat there, a bargain bin palace, waiting for a buyer brave enough to take on the history. It was eventually sold for roughly $8 million, a pitiful sum for a property of such scale, costing less than a modern penthouse in Manhattan. The low price was the final insult to the man who had built it to be the most expensive home in America. Today, Winfield Hall still stands on the Gold Coast of Long Island. It is currently undergoing restoration, stripped of its furniture, its halls echoing and empty. But if you walk through those rooms, the weight of the past is palpable. The house is a physical manifestation of a tragic truth that you can conquer the world, you can stack your coins until they touch the sky, and you can build walls that will last for 1,000 years, but you cannot build a home out of hubris. Frank Woolworth wanted to be Napoleon. He wanted a legacy, and he got one, but it is not the legacy he imagined as he sat in his boat bed dreaming of empire. His legacy is a cautionary tale written in stone. Winfield Hall remains the cursed mansion, a beautiful, terrifying monument to the five and dime king who learned the hardest lesson of all, that the most expensive things in life are the ones that cost you your soul. The coins have stopped falling, the organ has stopped playing, but the silence inside Winfield Hall is louder than any symphony.